It's not about what you have, it's about who you have. It's not about where you live, it's about how you live. And it's not about what you do, it's about why you do it. Welcome to the Momenticize podcast. Today I have got a guest on here. He's sold over $300 million worth of real estate over his career. I cannot wait to pick his brain on the multifamily sector, our favorite sector there is. Without further ado, please help me welcome Chuck Brazer to the podcast. So you've sold now over $300 million worth of product over your whole career. Tell us a little bit of how did you get there? Like, tell us the origin story and how you got there.
It's like pushing a square rock up a slippery slope. Yeah. A lot of hard work, perseverance, and that's probably the number one word I would use for it. But I've been in the game since 2003, June of 2003. And, it all kind of started for me when I was in college. I went to U of O, and I started as an architecture major, and quickly learned that some of my friends that had graduated from that program, I was an artist as a kid. I was good with numbers. I like drafting. I like drawing. I like interesting spaces that move you, right? And that was pinned. That's what I was going to do. But I had some friends in that program, and it's a very difficult program. Shout out to U of O architecture program. Great school. But as my friends graduated, they would get jobs at solid architecture firms. And I would stay in touch with them, and they'd be like, oh, well, you get thrown on a team and you're working on one small element of like a basic concrete tilt-up building. And I like spaces and buildings that have some style, some stylistic elements, some flair to it, as I call it. And I wanted to use that, which I had. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to get thrown into a big team and do that. And my next passion was business and economics. I like the visual approach to numbers like economics. And so I went that direction. But while I was in school, and I didn't really come from means, I usually had one or two jobs going through school. And I was taking 20 plus credits all the way through. I was on the 5.5 year program.
Boom.
So,
me too.
Right. So it was a grind, but I met someone in... I think it was a dad's weekend at U of O, and I met a friend of mine's dad who was a commercial broker down in San Diego for Colliers International, big worldwide firm, right? And I thought that commercial real estate was just selling skyscrapers. I didn't know the different product types within it. And at the time, interestingly enough, I was an on-site manager for a 15-unit apartment building. And it was an old 70s built building. They were quads, and a 70s built quad is pretty rough. So if you understand what quads are, it's basically 4 bedrooms. There's an interior door that goes into a shared hallway, a shared kitchen, and a shared bathroom. So it's
dorm room styles.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not the most comfortable living, but it was free, and I was a broke college kid. So it worked out well. Yeah. But I went from just having free rent, kind of being a liaison on site, to collecting rent, helping tenants with filling out applications, doing background checks, all that sort of stuff. And then I was doing turnover, minor maintenance. I was doing landscaping. So kind of a jack of all trades of this little building. And I was also more of a remote manager for a larger complex. It was, larger to me at the time, 35 units that was closer to campus. So what I didn't know at that time was I was understanding more of the operational side of multifamily, but I also didn't know that multifamily was, again, a niche of commercial real estate. So I was talking to this guy, I was interested, graduated school with studies in econ and business. And I did some interviews up in Portland, and I ended up getting a job with Marcus and Millichap. So they're a big nationwide investment sales only firm. They don't do any leasing. I think at the time they had 65 or 70 offices nationwide. And I sat down with my soon to be new manager. Yep. And I handed him my resume, which was, kind of a patchy, 22-year-old resume with a spattering of stuff on it. And he's like, oh, you manage an apartment building? And I said, yeah. He's like, well, multifamily is a niche of commercial real estate. I'm like, I did not know that. I should have, but I didn't. He's like, that's perfect for you. So he's like, all right, listen, for the next 2 months, you're going to build a database, and I want you to focus on Southeast Portland. Now, Portland is bisected by the Willamette River, north to south, and then Burnside, right? And then you have Northeast, Southeast, and so on. And I started more in outer Southeast, which was east of I-205. And for 2 months that summer, when I got hired, I essentially drove the market, took pictures, took down addresses, went back to the office, uploaded that in my computer, got phone numbers, got names, all that, built my database. And if you had a good enough database after two months, they would send you to Chicago for some pretty intense training where you learned kind of the art of a deal, how to negotiate contracts, how to cold call, all that. And one of my jobs in college was telemarketing. So I was comfortable on the phone. And then here I am with, kind of this operational experience with this apartment building. So I hit the ground running. And this was again in 2003. And it was nice because I'd have conversations with these building owners and I understood their day-to-day ops. So they would talk about, the trials and tribulations of evictions and maintenance and all this. And to me, I'm like, I understand that. I've dealt with that, Mr. Smith. I've gone through that. And so out of my graduating class, I kind of had a leg up in that sense. And that was a good market. There was a nice run up from, when I started in 02, 03 up to obviously, the recession, 07, 08. I accumulated some good relationships and got some deals under my belt. And
from your original database, or from, you built the database, was that, were they then having you work that database, or were they testing you out to say like, hey, is he what's his ability? Or did you then go and farm that database that you built out?
100%. And so I probably accumulated, my first database probably had 800 properties.
And purely from driving for properties. Yeah. So you were driving, getting to know the properties, feeling the neighborhoods, walking them.
Yeah.
Taking them down. Yeah. That was your database.
And there's lazier ways to build a database, right? Through looking at public record or looking at Google Maps or what have you. But I wanted to be on the ground because I wanted to see what was going on. Because oftentimes when you start a conversation or relationship with a new client, you're calling them on your building. So, Mr. Vanderbilt, I'm calling you on your 20 unit building on the corner of 4th and whatever, but if you see something nearby, maybe you're putting a new roof on, or there's a new complex going up across the street, you have what's called an interest generator, and you can start a good conversation, right? But yes, it was that database that I built that I then dug back into after training, and you start calling people. Yeah. And you got to be careful when you're new and you're green, because you don't want to steamroll people, right? And it was literally just a lesson in building rapport and building good relationships, right?
How many calls do you think you made before you had your first deal, if you had to guess?
Great question. So we had goals back then of 250 calls a week, which was a lot, especially if you'd never had any sort of phone experience. It's overwhelming. And like I said, I had some. And so, some of the newbies that would come out of training, they sounded very scripted, right? And we all get calls from telemarketers or whatever, and you can tell when they're reading off a script. And I took that and I round filed it. I'm like, that doesn't seem natural to me. And I took my experience and just being comfortable on the phone and just started saying, hey, what are you doing? What are your goals with your property? I've been by your property. Looks like you put on new roof, new windows, whatever. How can I be a resource to you? And that ended up going a lot further than just like, hey, do you want to list your building for sale? Is this
off a script? And they're like, no.
Exactly. And they can, anybody can see that from a mile away. But how many calls to my first, so how many no's to my yes, right?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Wow. So I started making calls in August. It probably took me 2 months to get my first listing. Yeah. And that would have been probably 700 calls.
Yeah. So you had you had 699 no's and then one yes to get your first listing.
Yeah. But what was valuable about that is the more that you talk to owners, the more you learn about what's going on in the market. And even here in Bend to this very day, I get most of my market data from the boots on the ground, right? People are out there experiencing it. And, you can look at different resources online or what have you, but just talking to the people that are in it, you get the most information. And so all those no's, you have to pull something good out of it, right? And so you learn something from each no, but you get more excited each no you get because you're getting closer. And my first listing was a 15-unit building way out on 181st in Southeast Portland. And I actually had sent him a mailer. And he got the mailer, and I had the wrong phone number, but his phone number. So if you ever had an old fax machine, you'd have a separate phone line to your fax machine at the time. And I called him, and his fax machine rang, but it had a phone on the fax machine. And he answered. He's like, nobody ever calls this number.
So
right?
it actually ended up working out.
So he answered it.
It was unique.
And he's like, I never answer this line either. And I'll never forget his name, Jerry.
Yeah.
I won't mention his last name, but he was retiring and needed to sell. And my heart was in my chest, and I was all excited and nervous, but I just said, hey, when can we meet? Let's talk about it. And that was my first listing. And because I was with a senior broker at the time, I got split and split and split again. I think I made $6,500 on that, which in commercial isn't a ton, but it was enough to get me out of my mom's apartment and get my own place. And it was off to the races after that.
Yeah, and get you a taste. One of the things I love about real estate, and it makes sense that you ended up being attracted towards it, having the creative background, but then also the business side. It's a lot of times people think that, or maybe people don't think this, but it would maybe seem that real estate is a numbers only game, but it is such a creative relationship, see what others maybe can't see yet type of game. It has this intersection between numbers and creativity that's what actually attracts me about it more than anything. Taking land, ground up game specifically, is taking seemingly nothing and turning it into something, and all the ideas and making sure it's financially feasible and then bring it to life. That's to me, one of the most like creative things you can do while still making it work with the numbers. So it makes a lot of sense that an architect turned into, or what you thought was going to be, you were going to be an architect, and then you ended up still being involved in real estate, but now in a creative numbers game.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, at the end of the day, we sell cash flows, and you're building cash flows. And unlike residential, where you're selling a living space, we all operate under the same license. We all basically do the same thing. But with commercial real estate, you're selling a cash flow. It's an investment vehicle, right? Just like a stock or a bond or an option or what have you. It's physical, it's tangible, which I believe in way more than that. But yeah, and again, I was good at numbers, and I liked underwriting. Underwriting is critical in marketing any property, and very critical in multifamily. That's where the rubber meets the road. Your income, all your expenses, which are constantly fluctuating, right? So in valuation of properties like that, the numbers play a key role. But when I see numbers, I see, it's going to sound funny, but I do see a sense of artwork to it, because it's constantly moving, and how those numbers move is how you get your value and your returns and all that. So yeah, I agree 100%.
Let's do a little, I agree with you, and the numbers tell the story, right? But let's do a little bit of how to value, just on a high level. How do you value a multifamily property for anybody who's listening? How do we actually go through and underwrite a multifamily deal and value it? Just break it down for us.
Yeah. So underwriting 101, which is critical, you also have to look through the lens of, most commercial real estate transactions are going to be financed, right? Yeah. So you have to look through the lens of a lender, and you also have to look through the lens of an appraiser. And they have certain standards when they appraise property. So what's standard vacancy in this market? What's standard reserves for this property? And a lot of owners, I've sold properties where literally their financials are on napkins and just, pieces of scrap paper.
Mom and pop style.
Exactly. And you have to break those apart and put them together. But, you have all of your rental income per month per unit, right? Yep. And then you have any additional income. So vending or pet fees, laundry fees. So that's all your above line income. Yep. And then you're going to have a standard vacancy. Now, if that building's been struggling a little bit, you're going to want to underwrite it to the actual vacancy. But if it's been performing pretty well, pretty stable, you're going to use a standard market vacancy of 5%. And I mean, that's pretty universal. It is down here too. And appraisers are going to underwrite to that as well. So from there, you get your scheduled gross income, and then you've got your standard expenses, which are taxes, insurance, maintenance and repairs, your utilities, landscaping. They're going to vary based on size of the building, and then reserves. Reserves are important. Generally, $250 to maybe $350 a unit for reserves, and every lender is going to make sure that that's in there. So after that, you get basically your operating income before your debt service. And so your NOI is, if you were to buy a building all cash, income, expenses, NOI, that's going to be your cash flow.
NOI is net operating income.
Exactly. And that cash flow would be your full-blown return on 100% down payment, right? But most people finance their properties. So below that is your debt service. Now your NOI based on a bank loan has a DCR, debt coverage ratio, which is going to be, in good markets, you can get 110 or 115. So they want to make sure that your NOI is either 110 or 115 or 120% of your debt service. They want to make sure that you're putting some money in your pocket and it's also going to cover your debt. Those have changed recently for obvious reasons. What's happening in our market now with liquidity and a tighter interest rate market. So beyond that, you get, from your NOI to value, you get a cap rate, right? So cap rates are going to be determined based on comps and what's going on in the market. Right now, cap rates are in the 6s generally. I'm going to say that's going to vary, and this is taking more of a macro snapshot across the country. Right now, generally cap rates are in that 6 to 6.2 range, but every building is going to be different. A newer property with nicer amenities and a nicer location, those are going to be fetching in the mid to high 5s. But the era of the 3s and the 4s is gone. I mean.
And do you think that that's because really the cap rate has to align with where interest rates are at? The higher interest rates go, the higher cap rates have to trend. Would you agree that is that when it was down at 3%, that's why we're seeing such low cap rates? Or how do you feel like the market works to set those cap rates?
Well, what you don't want to have is inverse yield, right?
Yep.
Where you're spending more on the cost of capital that you're borrowing than the return on the building.
Yep.
So yeah, your cap rates are going to fluctuate with these interest rates, and that is an overall higher cost to you with a higher debt payment, right? Yep. And so that's going to bring the value of the building down. When the value of the building comes down and maybe your NOI is stable, your cap rate's going to go up. Yep. And that's just what we're seeing. That's just the relationship there. When money is cheaper, cash flow is higher, and that makes buildings more valuable. Yeah. So then you get a compression of cap rates. So it's been interesting. We got used to very low cap rates for a long time, but I think the pandemic was a complete anomaly. I think most people would agree with that. But we got comfortable with it, and there's a new normal that's around the corner.
Yeah, 100%. It'll be very interesting to see how it continues to play out, especially as some of these loans are now maturing. Still, they're good assets. Mm-hmm. They have good tenants. The rents are at market, maybe a little bit below, but usually at market. But now the cost of capital, where cost of capital is, and as that debt's maturing, it doesn't pencil anymore at the current debt that's on there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. That's been rippling. If anyone's listening, that's been rippling through the news the whole entire time. So it'll be interesting to see what actually ends up happening there, and if there's going to be really, really good deals or not. I'm curious, what do you think about that? Are we going to see a bunch of stuff that's going to come up for sale at a good price, or are we going to work through this and what's going to happen there?
If you need to sell, then the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But for investors that are long-term, that are against this challenge, what I'm hearing more and more of is lenders quietly working with their clients. Okay. So if that's a loan modification, if that's some sort of adjustment to the terms within their loan, and this also keeps the distressed sort of situation down, and people are talking about that too. Are we going to have another, 2008 sort of crisis with all these distressed properties and loans going under? But lenders are more and more willing to work with you as an owner to not have that happen. But around the corner, are we going to have a more favorable refinancing sort of situation too? So Jerome Powell is indicating that we'll get at least one rate reduction this year at the end of the year, and into 2025, maybe a few more. So can a lender extend that into 2025 where refinance is going to make more sense, right? So I'm seeing way more flexibility that's maybe unspoken or maybe not on paper, but there's a lot more flexibility with lenders to avoid that sort of situation. But yeah, if you need to sell and you have to sell now and you're faced with these market conditions, are there going to be some good deals out there? Sure. Yeah. I think so.
Yeah, there's a great saying, he or she who needs it more is going to have to take the cut, right? So if you really need to sell, then yeah, you're going to be taking a haircut for it. And some good friends, some good mentors of mine are dealing with some challenging situations right now where they had projects that started and it ended up with a combination between COVID plus incompetence of the builders that they hired. A project that should have taken 12 to 16 months ended up taking 3 years. And what's happened with the cost of capital today, where they thought they were going to get in the 5 or 6% interest rate, now they're getting quoted at 7 or 8%, and that really changes the picture.
Spot.
Yeah, it's a tough spot. So, but like you said, most of those situations, the banks don't want the property back. The property's still a good property. So how do they work together in a partnership to extend it out as, like you said, as we potentially see an ease in rates as we head into 2025. So it's not like this crazy, all these properties are falling apart, you know. And I think that the news, one thing that always happens in the news, right, is, I mean, you could see it across the board. If you look at patterns of the news, they make their money off fear mongering people.
Oh, right? Yeah, 100%.
That's where the money is made. And so I try to always pay attention to it and then sift through the noise, put the pieces of the puzzle together. I remember when they were pushing the housing crisis coming, right? Housing crisis. You know, that's going to happen again. It's going to be a repeat, et cetera. And then that's the noise in the news. And then you look at, for example, somebody who I would consider one of the greatest investors of all time, Warren Buffett. Well, there's going to be a housing crisis in the news, but Warren Buffett puts almost $1 billion into 3 new home builders, right? So who do you want to listen to? And I think that you gotta, when the news is zigging, you gotta zag and pay attention to what's really happening, because real estate, what I love about real estate is fundamentally, it's one of the best games you could be in. Even, it doesn't matter, like interest rates, rents, et cetera. It's just the simple supply demand, and it's a basic need that we have. So I love that component of real estate.
Interesting segue when you say Warren Buffett. So I was born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Okay.
And then my folks got divorced when I was younger. My mom and my brother and I moved out to Oregon. My dad stayed in Lincoln and then moved to Omaha. And he lived in Omaha.
How old were you then? How old were you when you moved out here?
Oh, I was probably 8 at the time, so pretty young. But when my dad was younger, he lived in Omaha, and he used to do yard work at Warren Buffett's house in Regency, Omaha, the same home he lives in today. Still drives, I don't know if this is the case anymore, but a Prius, and he goes to McDonald's every day. Snowball, great book. I'm sure you've read it. But no, I agree with you on that. My dad was also a stockbroker in the 70s and 80s, and he was feast or famine. And that's where, when I shifted from architecture into business, it was because when I was younger, hanging out with him at the stock brokerage, you know, it was very interesting to me that you could own a small pie slice of a company, right, that appreciated, maybe gave you a dividend. It was interesting, but it was on paper to me. And to this day, and this is just personal opinion, but, you know, running the stock market is kind of like professional gambling, but you don't have any control over it. It's not a physical asset that you can actually add value to, right? And so I believe wholeheartedly in the tangible physical real estate, because you can add value and you are in control of it. And it's always going to, you know, spin off a dividend, if you will. And especially multifamily specific. Not everybody needs a storefront, but you need a place to live. And in this market where so many home buyers are priced out, there's more and more people seeking a place to rent. I had read somewhere a couple of weeks ago that there is a 40% margin between average rents in this country and the cost of a monthly mortgage. That's huge.
It's huge. Massive. That right there signals, if there's anything else that signals that a renter's nation is coming, whether you like it or not, there is a huge wave of a renter's nation coming, and it's just the beginning of it because of that stat that you just said right there. And what, just so everybody understands what Chuck is saying there, he's saying that if you want to, we could put it into numbers here, if you want to buy in Bend, Oregon, the median home price in Bend, Oregon is now north of $700,000, right? So if you want to buy in Bend, Oregon in a great location like Northwest Crossing, let's use that as an example. That's on the west side, a great place to live, great location, shops, etc., schools. If you want to buy there, you're going to be paying probably no less than $800,000. If you go and work backwards, first you have to come up with 20%. You could put 5 down, but let's say you come up with 20%. We're talking almost $200,000 you have to come up with to put down. It's a lot of money. Then on top of that, your monthly payment is going to be, we'd have to do the exact numbers, but $4 or $5 $5,000 a month just to live in that home.
Yeah.
Now, if you wanted to also live in Northwest Crossing, so you'd have to come up with a couple $100,000 down plus $4,000 or $5,000 a month for the mortgage payment. Now, if you also wanted to live in Northwest Crossing, but you wanted to rent there, you could rent an apartment there for somewhere between $1,800 to $2,400, right? So that spread is huge. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's going to change. I think that that's just going to continue.
Yeah.
And you're going to see home prices continue to go up. The national average right now just got reported. It's up to $419,000 is the national average of the home cost, $419,000, right? So even that mortgage payment alone is in the $2,500, right? And putting 20% down, you're still talking about huge amounts of money. So I think that there's going to be a huge wave of that, and multifamily comes in and solves that problem.
Yep.
So
100%. It's interesting because when rates were low, a lot of landlords were challenged with high turnover because you had a lot of first-time home buyers where that margin was a lot thinner, right? It was way more affordable to go out and buy a home. But now with that margin, it's extremely difficult.
You think they're going to combat it with like 40-year mortgages and stuff like that? Or what do you think they're going to?
I don't know. I read somewhere right now that so baby boomers, call it 1990, they represent almost 20% of
home ownership,
of net worth in the U.S.
Net worth,
and
okay.
millennials are only 6%. So the ability to come up with a down payment like that is extremely difficult, right?
Well, added on the big challenges of that, like you said, the boomers are at 20% net worth, and then the millennials are at 6% of the net worth. On top of it, what was normalized was go to school, invest in yourself, take on all this debt. By the way, you're 18 years old. You have no idea or concept yet of what that's going to mean when you come out of school. So you get strapped with all this debt. In the meantime, housing prices are rising more than ever. Wage growth isn't growing. And now you're going to try to go buy a home. Like that creates a very challenging situation because most people who have that student debt challenge, I mean, that's a 5-10 year, just after you get out of school, that's a 5-10 year process to get that paid down. Then you have to go and save up. So yeah, it's whether it's liked or not liked, there is a renter's nation coming.
100%.
And I think there's a ton of opportunity there.
And rates are still going to be sticky well into next year, right? So anybody that's waiting for lower rates, even this first rate cut or the second or even third, there's still going to be a nice margin there, right? Where it's going to be way more affordable to rent. Where the challenge lies, in my opinion, is families, right? So if you have a smaller growing family, an apartment situation isn't necessarily going to be the best. Yeah. And one of the biggest trends that I see on a macro level, which I don't see a lot of here, and I'm surprised, are you familiar with BTR? So
no.
Build to rent. Okay. So this is a concept that is blowing up, obviously in the Sun Belt where there's a huge supply of multifamily units, but what you have is multifamily developers that are building developments that are just single family homes. So if that's 180 single family homes or 200 or 80 or whatever it is, this is a huge trend because you have, again, families where an apartment space may not be the best, where you have a small family that wants a yard, that has pets, that wants a little bit more space, that wants a garage, and that wants to give a shot to home ownership to see what it feels like to live in a home. And these BTR developments are trading like crazy. They're super hot right now. And it makes sense because you have, again, so many more priced out would-be home buyers that are renters. But if they have a couple of kids or some kids on the way, a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment may not be the best. Yeah. And so some developers are having some huge success doing that in other markets. And I think it would do well here, but I'm not seeing it. Yeah. So there's an interesting opportunity.
Yeah, I think I agree with you 100% on that. And we're on we have 2 buckets, our business. We have like the spec build bucket where we buy land, build from the ground up and build specs. The whole goal of that is to provide housing and to make whatever money we can make. I'm then just trying to pile that into assets. Like you said, the cash is trash to me. I just want as many assets as I possibly can. And for me, it is the hard assets. So the stocks, it doesn't work well for me. I don't know it. I can't control it. But real estate, like you said, I can see, feel, touch, control. I can add value to it. The apartments, if you see stuff that others can't see, or you want to add some storage units to it, or you want to make sure your landscaping is really good, or you want to make sure your operations are running well, you can see it, you can feel it, you can touch it, right? Versus the stock game, although I know the returns are good for people who know it, I don't know it, right? So the goal is put as much capital as we can, make as much capital here, put it in the apartments. And I think that the thing that when I'm looking over here and what I'm learning and thinking about is, okay, you got these apartments, you can provide that housing, but we're trying to get more and more creative on the specs that we're building. And we're doing stuff like we just created a model where, and everyone's doing this isn't new, but we're doing a single family house on the main floor and then a garage with an ADU that either you could turn into multi-generational living, or if you're a family that really wants to buy a home, you can now buy a home, and that $2,500 or $3,500 payment you can now subsidize with a renter in your ADU upstairs. So I think getting more creative in that single family built product to try to either make it so multiple families could live in there, or you can live in there and rent it, be your first investment property. We're trying to design that type of product to combat some of the challenges that we see. So.
Well, and Ben's been great about allowing that sort of change within zoning and density, right? And it makes sense.
Yeah.
It totally makes sense.
To me, it's always what drives pricing. Well, it's a supply demand game, right? So on the development side, you know how hard it is for us to get a building permit? You know how difficult and challenging it is? So it's funny, you got this mixed message. You got these people saying, hey, we're in a housing crisis, we need more housing, but they make it massively difficult to get a permit. And it's not like for reasons that make any sense. For example, what will happen is you submit for a permit, and most of the people that are in this world are the same. It's the same people doing the same stuff, the same architects, engineers, civil engineers, builders. Like the world is pretty small overall, right? But there's no mechanism to, one, maybe have a qualified architect. Or for example, if I was running the permitting business as my private business, and this is one of the challenges, they're getting better. I will tip my hat to that. But if I was running that as a private business, what they should or could do is, hey, you got these comments. Sometimes we get silly comments like, something as silly as the header size needs to change, or like, it's so silly, like red line comments that are so silly.
What's the turnaround time on review for that?
They kick it back out to you.
Yeah.
And then now you have to redo it and submit it again. And then it's another 2 weeks, right? So each time that happens, it takes, let's say from time of wanting to build something to getting a permit can take, in some cases, 12 months. Like that's ridiculous. Yeah. Where they could do is, if they had any sort of private business sense, you would put the red comment on and say to be checked at inspection. The inspector comes and looks at it anyways, right? And so I think that there's just, if we want to solve it, we can go the affordability, government grant, et cetera process, but we also as a community need to put some pressure on these municipalities who our tax money is we are paying these people to process and protect our communities. And they are, in some cases, not all cases, they are underperforming in their duty to do so. Because if you were to get permits quicker, you'd have less barrier to entry, more supply. And with more supply, you'd get better product and cheaper product. That's the answer to it. So I think that people need to start looking at that and not be like, oh, greedy developer or affordable. It's like, no, come together and let's put some smart pressure on these people that are being paid our tax dollars to make it happen. And we are doing that. Like, I tip my hat. The system is not easy, but with some small tweaks, like running it like a private business, we could see an ease, and then more supply. That also solves affordability, right?
That's a huge reflection of Bend too, right? I mean, Bend is not, we're a growing community, but it's been exponential, right? And you have some systems that are out of date. You have some people there that are inundated with the growth that we're experiencing.
It's hard,
It's totally hard. And I don't know really how to get there. I agree with you. But how do we get there? What does it take? Yeah,
I think it's enough people voicing it. Like, I'll tip my hat, for example. I know that in Deschutes County, they're really pushing to try to speed that process up. What used to take 6 to 8 weeks, and that was just their normal response, we're now getting some building permits in 3 days. So I'm very impressed with that, and I'm happy with that type of change. And I think that comes with, that's like how you create real change. I don't think that more government intervention actually helps solve these problems in a long term. I think that free market capitalism actually solves them, and because it allows competition, and competition drives improvement. And so I think that it is improving. And again, it's so easy to point fingers and be like, oh, the city, I hate the city, et cetera. That's not necessarily the answer. It's a hard system to run, but the more pressure that gets put on, and the more communication and like positive brainstorming that goes about it,
they got to move.
The better it'll go. So we'll see how it unfolds.
So, and this is probably more towards residential, but doesn't Bend have a program where they have a template for ADUs? I believe it is ADUs, where it's a prepackaged approved sort of situation or plan where that turnaround time is much quicker, just to increase density, just to increase housing, right?
Exactly. And my hat's tipped. Like, everyone is working on it. My hat is tipped towards the working on it. I just think that a massive sense of urgency could continue to be brought to it.
Yep.
Right. And it's the silly, like those templates are great. Or House Bill 2001 that got introduced that now allows people to add more density into their already existing land. I think those are great programs. It's just what gets frustrating is the ticky tacky, like, what could be a red line comment to be taken care of at inspection, because we have to inspect it anyways. That would fast track a massive amount of stuff. And so I think that, plus I will also say the combination of how expensive it's getting just to pull a building permit, right? Like, the fees are just continuing to increase, and that's part of the whole game. But
July 1, right?
July 1, that passes all the way through. Pivoting off that and onto then, because July 1, you made me also think about, I think another thing comes into effect July 1 is that the
SDCs.
The SDCs, but what about the Real Estate Commission? Is that July 1 that comes into effect or not anymore?
Oh, yeah. So NAR's situation, which affects residential.
Okay.
Commercial's somewhat, it's not applicable to commercial contracts or commercial listing agreements. So,
but what do you think about that? And then what's it like also working for a commission, like in a commission-based world? Both of those.
That's a whole other discussion.
I know. Let's start with the commission-based world. What's that like even?
Well, again, like I mentioned, my dad was a stockbroker and he wasn't a W-2, right? So it was feast or famine. I learned that pretty quick, and we had some great years and we had some salad years, right? And I didn't totally understand it, but I'll tell you this: when I was going through high school and into college, I think it's the athlete in me. And like I told you earlier, I've always had kind of a fourth quarter mentality. I like to win. I like not having a glass ceiling, right? So I believe in getting out what you put in and the grind. And I think you should be rewarded for the harder you work. And to me, that equated to, more of either a business ownership sort of role. And I don't really know what that looked like at the time, but real estate made sense to me. And I knew it was commission only. My first manager said, "You're only as good as your last paycheck." Yeah. And there's nothing but truth to that. And it can be scary at times. And I've been through different markets where I may not get paid for 3 or 4 months. And then sometimes I get paid a couple times a month. And it's tricky. You got to be smart about it. You have to save well, and budget. And you also have these exogenous shocks to our economy, which was the recession, which was an anomaly. There's a lot of greed there. The CMBS market, imploded, which had never really happened before, and nobody really prepared for it. And then COVID. I mean, who would have? I'm sure there's some scientists out there, environmentalists, that would say, it was bound to happen or it may happen again, but we didn't see that coming. Yeah. But it's tough, but it's also very rewarding because, if you provide good service to your clients and you go the extra mile and you really treat relationships as longer term relationships, you should be good, but it's scary. I mean, as a developer, you have so much equity tied up in one project. And if that's a project that you need to release and sell, you're only as good as your last paycheck too, in a sense, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it definitely works that way. And development is extremely capital intensive. Sometimes you're like, whoa, what's just going out and going out and going out.
Yeah.
So what do you say to a young man or woman who's listening to this, who feels the same way you do, that's competitive, doesn't like the glass ceiling, trying to figure out what to do? What's a piece of advice? That commission only scares them a little bit. What's a piece of advice for them?
Yeah. Let's just say, in real estate, right? Yeah. They want to be a real estate agent.
Yeah.
My first hiring manager also said, "Hey, you got a nest egg too," right? Because I think it's fair to say you're not going to get paid for 6 to 8 months.
Yep.
Probably longer in commercial. And I luckily did or I told my manager that, but it was a struggle.
You were eating a lot of ramen.
I just wanted the job, man. I wanted to get going.
Make it happen. Yeah.
Be patient and realize that it's going to be difficult, and perseverance is going to pay off, right? So don't keep your eye off that prize, or don't take your eye off that prize, because it will pay off if you keep grinding, if you build that database, if you make good contacts, good relationships, get in front of people. That's key. And it will come around. And the better service you do to your clients, they're going to talk to people too, right? And referral business is big, obviously, in residential and commercial too. So just keep at it, but be patient and give yourself, extend that. Go 12 months. Know that first 12 months in any sort of independent contractor situation, especially real estate agent, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be tough, but keep your eye on the prize, because it's worth it. And where our market's going into the next 5-10 years out of this, markets are cyclical. This will pass just like everything does. But catch that on the way up and don't quit.
Yeah. Like you said, I was going to ask, is it worth it? And I think you already answered it. It is worth it. It's just staying in the game long enough to get to that point.
Yeah.
Right. We have another one of my great friends who was on also commission only. He had a similar thing where it was like 12 months, nothing.
Yeah.
Even got upsetting because he was supposed to start getting some paychecks, and they had not to his fault. He was working for a new build situation, selling new build homes. And he had all these homes sold. They were supposed to get C of O close on them. And there was a small little land use issue they had, so they couldn't get C of O. So he was expecting to get a paycheck after maybe 8 months in, and then it just was like, oh, actually, nope, more delays. But exactly like you said, then boom, out of nowhere in 1 month, it's more than he'd ever made.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just sticking with it. Sometimes people will quit, or they'll even get the pressures. I remember he was talking to me like, his family members, people that loved him, cared about him. Like, what are you doing? Like, you're crazy. You have no security here. Like, go get it. You got to go get a job, et cetera. And he's like, no, I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to stick with this. And, boom, it all happened. Just like you said.
Something else that I've lived by too, which has been valuable. And I don't remember who told me this, but you can't get too high and you can't get too low. Yeah. You have to remain flat, because you don't know if you're going to go into one of those. There was a period, I think it was, I want to say 2011, we were well out of the recession. And I grinded. I worked. I got in front of people. I couldn't tell you how many valuations on how many apartment properties. I was doing all the right things.
Sharpening your saw too, which is good. Yeah.
And I had a couple listings that just didn't move, and other people were selling stuff. And I had a dry year, almost a full year. And I was scratching my head, and I'm like, what happens? That's going to happen sometimes for no reason that's your own fault. It's just sometimes that's going to happen no matter how hard you work, but you have to stay at it. I remember 2008, I had a couple of really good clients that had a lot of smaller properties. So these were 8 to 12 unit buildings. And I got really tied up into, I think I had 3 clients, all of which had either 2 or 3 or 4 of these smaller properties. So they didn't yield a bunch of commission for me, but I was busy and I didn't know what was right around the corner come August, September. Right. And then that happened and I didn't make a paycheck the following year. 2009 was rough, very rough. Actually, I think I made $10,000 that year on a deal that was a loan assumption. The only deal was getting done right then because the faucet was off for financing.
Everything was just...
There was a couple of cash deals and then a lot of loan assumptions that were happening. And I was stuck, and I saw some very high-level seasoned brokers up in Portland that either took early retirements or they went to a different sort of, industry altogether. And these were high level guys that had been around, 20, 30 years. And I got frustrated and I felt myself getting too low. Right. And I told myself, can't get too high, can't get too low, use this energy to find a solution. Right. And so I'm like, well, the money's got to be somewhere. There's got to be deals getting done some way. And I was on my way home. And I drove by the county courthouse and I saw all these people standing on the steps of the courthouse. I'm like, what's going on there? I pulled over and I walk up and I see all these guys with these little white envelopes and there's a guy auctioning off property. And this is tricky and I got to be careful because at that time, behind every foreclosure, there's a story.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a rosy story. I was upside down on my home at the time. A lot of my good friends were. I had a good friend down here in Bend that was in construction, lost that job, lost his home. It was a rough time for everybody. And so I got to tread lightly here. But it was also a case of survival too. And so I met a guy on the courthouse steps. I'm like, what are you guys doing? Like, well, these are foreclosures and, you know, they're auctioning these things off all cash. I'm like, well, how do you find these? Like, there's so many of them. We don't have time to go find these. You want to help us out? And I'm like, yeah, because my business was stuck again, because all the top apartment lenders in the market at that point, they weren't lending money. I mean, there was nothing. It was just a stick in the water. So I ended up helping this group trying to get creative to do something. And so I would go out and look at these foreclosed properties. And I'm not an inspector, you know, but I've been through enough inspections to know the basics. And with some architecture background, I can tell if a building's in good condition or not. Yeah. And they had some requirements, you know, some kind of standard sort of things that they needed to see in a deal. And I would find these deals, report back to them, and they'd go buy them. And I'd get a little finder's fee or whatever. And, you know, you have to get creative in times of turmoil to keep your head afloat, you know? Yeah. So you got to get creative. Just be patient. Yeah. Perseverance, right?
I love that story. I think that's that's one of those like positive pivots when the situation, when many people are leaving, even senior people, they're leaving, right? And you stayed with it, and that don't get too high, don't get too low. That's a true champion mindset, a true competitor champion mindset. It's actually something that our coach taught us as well. You know, it's good to celebrate what you want to see more of, but don't celebrate too much, right? When you get that big commission, don't count it. Like you said, you're only as good as your last commission. So don't celebrate too much on it. And then don't get too low during the period where you had no sales for a year. Just don't get too high, don't get too low. The best competitors, if you study the 1% in the entire world, they stay even keel, right?
Exactly.
They're able to rebound off a big mistake. They still celebrate what they want to see more of. Like, it's not like when something really good happens, you're still going to celebrate. Go celebrate that, because that's good energy to put out. But I love that quote. And it's something that actually we live by as well when the pressure's on, right? That's good for both ways. I love it. What's one of your least favorite things about being in real estate?
Oh, wow. I'd have to think about that one. I mean, if it's not the consistent paycheck, which is, you know, I don't know. I mean, we've kind of talked about it. It's things outside of your control that can affect, you know, our market, right? The anomalies, the exogenous stuff that can affect our market. And it seems like the financial memory of our country is about 10 or 12 years when you look at recession to pandemic. And I wasn't in for whatever one was before that, but things can happen that are outside of our control, outside our country's control. You've got things that are going on in Ukraine and with, lack of materials and supply chain issues and stuff over in Palestine, things that are totally out of our control, that move our markets, right? They can put strain on us. That's frustrating, you know, as hard as you work, and those things can affect you.
It's my least favorite part too. Things I can't control. You know? Things I can't control. Right? The things I can't control. What's your favorite deal you've ever done?
Favorite deal I've ever done? Yeah. You know, I knew you'd ask me this, or maybe one of my most challenging deals.
Memorable, whatever it is.
Well, there's one that encompasses both. One of my most challenging deals and one of my most satisfying deals. And it wasn't necessarily a big transaction. And, you know, I'll keep the parties anonymous because it was interesting. There was a, you know, I have to be respectful. Yeah. There's a 48 unit apartment building in Beaverton. Okay. We'll just leave it at that. And the owner approached me and said that he had a personal issue. He was motivated. He needed to sell his property. And I went and met with him. And this is all I knew at the time. But when we sat down, he's like, well, there's also a lawsuit that's in place. So he had bought this building about 2 years prior. And he was represented by the same agent that was representing the seller. Unbeknownst to him was a lot of deferred maintenance going on that you couldn't see in this building. Yeah. Okay. So in Portland, for whatever reason, a lot of flat roof buildings. Okay. Yeah. And we're in one of the most rainiest states in the union. So
it makes no sense.
It doesn't make any sense. I mean, if they're done right, they work fine. But a lot of them weren't. This was a late 60s built property, fairly good condition from what you could see, but this roof had been leaking for a very long time. And of these 48 units, there was multiple buildings on this property. And these flat roofs had been leaking through all of the perimeter exterior walls for years. It was rotting from the inside out. And it was, so I had stepped into this mess, but this guy was a sweetheart, and he really needed to get his equity out for another reason. And he had a physical inspection when he bought it, and he noticed some mold, and mold is not entirely uncommon, especially in Portland. But he moved forward. Also, what he didn't know was that the seller and the agent representing both of them was aware of this too. So there was some litigation that had already gotten started when I got involved. He said, here's the deal. My building's rotting from the inside out. I need to sell. There's litigation. The lender was also made aware of this too. So the real market value of this property, based on, what is now material fact, was essentially less than half. And so he's like, I know what my situation is. I'm probably going to have to sell this building for half price. So we dug into the numbers. I became educated on it. There were a team of lenders involved because they were going to essentially need to short sale this loan. The lender's attorneys, the seller's attorneys, and the attorney from the other parties. So it was very dynamic, very convoluted situation. And meanwhile, he needs to get out for another issue. So we ended up listing the property for essentially half price and disclosing the fact that this is what it is. It's going to take a unique buyer to step in. By the way, full disclosure, this is going on in the background. I knew the perfect buyer for this project. And this was kind of an up and coming apartment owner in Portland.
Just somebody that just knew how to make it happen.
Well, you mentioned earlier, trash is cash, but they also had some good economies of scale, some good relationships where they had some good margins with their own in-house construction teams and this and that. This was a good project for them, and they were patient and they understood, a situation like this. So I immediately called this buyer, gave him the story. And they were like, we like the deal. What do you need us to do? What sort of timeline? We'll be patient. It was a great buyer. They were perfect for the deal. So this overall transaction probably it wasn't too bad. It was 75 or 90 days, given all the things that were going on in the background. But we all had to chip in. The bank had to take a huge haircut on their loan. Obviously, the seller lost a ton of equity in this. Yeah. The litigation went on beyond closing, and he ended up winning that litigation. But the satisfaction that I got for getting my seller out of that situation, his equity on to take care of his personal thing, was, to me, special. We spent a lot of time together, often obviously talking about the deal, but I formed a good relationship with him, and that was more valuable to me than any sort of monetary compensation. And I really enjoyed that deal. So that was both one of the most challenging deals I've ever been through, and also one of the most satisfying. So it was a crazy story, but it was a good story at the end of the day. Yeah. And disclose deferred maintenance owners out there. It'll keep everybody good. Yeah. Just disclosure.
Look at those disclosures. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. I mean, that is a crazy, crazy story, but that's also what's so cool about, like, we go circling back to the beginning, real estate. It isn't just purely a numbers game. It's a relationship game and a creative game. And there's a lot of pieces that happen. The property alone has a lot of history and story to it. And then the personalities that come with it as well. So that's a cool story. I like that. I like that story. Chuck, what are some books that really influence you, that changed your life, that you would recommend to people?
Well, Snowball was one of them, which I mentioned earlier.
That's Warren Buffett book.
Yeah. One of the first books I read, and I'm not a huge reader, I never really was, but Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Kiyosaki is fantastic. That one probably had the most impact. That was the first one I read cover to cover that was really about understanding investments and return and accumulating assets, right? And that one shifted my view on, and my interest in owning physical real estate over, stock. I've read a ton of stock books and investing for dummies and day trading for dummies and all that, because I almost went down that path that my dad did. But again, I believe in physical assets. You're going to get appreciation. You're going to get a dividend. You can control it. All the things we talked about. So yeah.
Yeah, Rich Dad Poor Dad is similar for me. It just completely changed my life. That book. He's
100%.
Robert Kiyosaki's really shifted the world in that way. If you were to go back and talk to 18, 22-year-old Chuck, what's one thing you would say? What's one thing you would say to him?
How much time do you have, man?
Give me a one-liner, one quote. What do you got for him? Like something you'd say to him that they're worried about at that time, but now that you've grown.
Well, I mean, obviously, this is a real estate podcast, but I would have bought a house soon. And there's a young man that I helped raise in my life, and I had him make me a promise. By the time you're 21, buy a home. Doesn't have to be fancy. Just buy a home, start building equity. And I wish I would have did that. That's probably what I would have told myself. I mean, because hindsight's 20/20, but the older you get, the more appreciate real estate. I would have done that, and I would have been one of the first people at 18 or 20 if I could have. And I saved money, but I spent it on cars and goofy dumb things like we all do.
Buy a home.
Buy a home. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of other things, but. That'd be the number one thing.
Yeah, sure. I would not have, if I would have guessed 100 times, I would have not guessed that. And funny enough, I couldn't agree more, because it's where you can really start to build equity. And that first home teaches, if you want to be in the real estate game, buying a primary home, starting early over time is just going to create a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
That's a good piece of advice.
Yeah.
Chuck, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it. Really enjoyed building our relationship. I know we're going to do a lot of transactions in the future. And thanks for sharing some knowledge with us.
You got it. I love what you're doing. I've been in this business 22 years, but I've been watching your podcast and it gets me excited. It lights a fire. So good on you for what you're doing.
Thanks for coming on. And with that, we will see you on the next one, baby.